the truth. That Britain was a middle-ranking power, given unusual influence by virtue of its historical distinction, skilled diplomacy, and versatile military forces, but greatly weakened by economic decline, seemed too complex for sophisticated people to grasp. What made this more dangerous in the late 1970s was that the United States was undergoing a similar crisis of morale following its failure in Vietnam. Hobbled by its psychological constraint, two presidents saw the Soviet Union and its surrogates expand their power and influence in Afghanistan, Southern Africa, and Central America by subversion and outright military invasion. In Europe, an increasingly self-confident Soviet Union was planting offensive missiles in its eastern satellites and building its conventional forces to levels far in excess of NATO equivalents. It was also constructing a navy that would give it global reach. A theory, coined after the collapse of communism, to justify the policy of doves in the Cold War, holds that because the Soviet Union was comparatively weak in the late 1980s, after almost a decade of Western economic and military revival, it must have been a hollow threat in the 1970s. Quite apart from the logical absurdity of placing a cause after its effect, the history of the Soviet Union from 1917 until just the other day refutes this argument. The Soviet Union was a power which deliberately inflicted economic backwardness on itself for political and ideological reasons, but compensated for this by concentrating resources on its military sector and by using the power this gave it to obtain further resources by force or the threat of force. Taken together, these three challenges, long-term economic decline, the debilitating effects of socialism, and the growing Soviet threat, were an intimidating inheritance for a new Prime Minister. I ought perhaps to have been more cowed by them in my imagination than in fact I was as we drove back to Flood Street. The emotion I felt was exhilaration at the challenge. Some of this exhilaration came from meeting a wide range of my fellow countrymen in 4 years as opposition leader. They were so much better than the statistics said, more energetic, more independent, more restive at the decline of the country, and more ready than many of my parliamentary colleagues to support painful measures to reverse that decline. I sensed that a sea change had occurred in the political sensibility of the British people. They had given up on socialism and were ready to try something else. That sea change was our mandate. And there was a more personal factor. Chatham, Prime Minister from 1766 to 68, famously remarked, "I know that I can save this country, and that no one else can." It would have been presumptuous of me to have compared myself to Chatham, but if I'm honest, I must admit that my exhilaration came from a similar conviction. My background and experience were not those of a traditional Conservative Prime Minister. I was less able to depend on automatic deference, but I did not feel I needed an interpreter to address people who spoke the same language. And I felt it was a real advantage that we had lived the same sort of life. I had grown up in a household that was neither poor nor rich. We had to economize each day in order to enjoy the occasional luxury. My father's background as a grocer is sometimes cited as the basis for my economic philosophy. So it was, and is. My father was both a practical man and a man of theory. He liked to connect the progress of our corner shop with the great complex romance of international trade, which recruited people from all over the world to ensure that a family in Grantham could have on its table rice from India, coffee from Kenya, sugar from the West Indies, and spices from 5 continents. Before I read a line from the great liberal economists, I knew from my father's accounts that the free market was like a vast sensitive nervous system, responding to events and signals all over the world to meet the ever-changing needs of peoples in different countries with a kind of benign indifference to their